You've got quite an interest in skulls, in particular the skulls at Edinburgh University's Anatomy Museum. How does that link into India?
Yeah, I mean, the skulls are really interesting. Edinburgh, as I expect you know, has a long history of anatomy professors who were very prominent. They were not just people who taught medical students, they held public lectures, they were public intellectuals, and indeed major families handed down the position of anatomy professor, as it were, between them. So we have three with the same name, father, son, and grandson. Edinburgh really was very interested in anatomy, and this has been widely discussed. When it comes to skulls, the really interesting role that Edinburgh played starts really with the development of phrenology. And the phrenologists were very important in Edinburgh society. They believed that it was possible to identify aspects of somebody's personality through feeling the bumps and crevices and indentations of the skull bones, and people would go to be tested and have their personality features identified by people who claimed to be able to do this. And this generated a lot of controversy within the medical profession at the time, and pretty soon the standard position of doctors was to say that phrenology was not a scientific activity. But that didn't mean that it disappeared from view. And there's a man called George Combe who wrote a book about this, which was incredibly successful as a popularizing statement about what phrenology was and how one could use this to understand people's lives. So they collected skulls from around the world, and some of them came from India. And there is a really interesting case of a man with a medical degree from the University of Edinburgh, George Murray Patterson, who decided to go to India. It's not quite clear why. He had an MD from 1817, and he went out to India and he did a variety of things. One of the things he did was to set up a school near Calcutta. And at that school, every month, he would measure the skulls of the pupils and see how they developed. So he believed that this wasn't just something that was innate, but that actually education, for example, might change the balance of different aspects of the brain and affect the development of the skull. And therefore, the phrenology was not just a matter of seeing what was there, but you could actually, in some senses, influence it. His most notable contribution to the phrenology debate is a long article that he published in the 1820s about the phrenology of the Hindus. And this was quite well publicized and was taken very seriously as far as one can tell. What it shows is the beginnings of a kind of scientific racism, because in writing this article, he talks about a whole range of things, and I'm not going to try and explain all of those, but he also talks about how phrenology can shed light on why Hindus are inveterate liars, for example. So he saw the idea of a racial bias towards telling untruths, being unable to tell the truth, being too willing to tell people what they wanted to know and not what was actually the case. Now, his article, as I say, I think was quite influential in the field at the time, but he himself came to a rather bad end. He clearly went rather mad, very simply put. He was sent back from India a few years later, and finally he died having been discovered, his naked body having been discovered in the New Forest. He'd obviously had some kind of serious mental attack and wandered around until he died from exposure.